You may not know this, but you are in fact an art lover. Now, I am very mediocre when it comes to putting a brush to canvas because the final painting I produce is nothing like what I have imagined in my head. But I do have a camera and I can create my own masterpieces, and so can you. I'm going to break down a creative concept inspired by Vermeer's masterpiece, The Girl with the Pearl Earring, so that you can go out and recreate a masterpiece for yourself. And we're going to look at the concept, inspiration, and my creative choices, the studio setup and equipment that I used, the storytelling that I used to convey this concept, my editing process, and the lessons I learned and the adjustments that I would make if I were to shoot it again. My love of fine art came from me working in my local gallery and seeing up close some of the real masterpieces of art. And this particular painting done by Vermeer, it is very exotic and it's very captivating, and it's captivated many people who have stood and admired it for many, many years. So my storytelling and creative choices were that I wanted to reimagine this classic masterpiece in a more modern version. And I wanted the subject to seem like she was actually in her private boudoir and she was admiring herself in the mirror. I wanted the viewer to feel like they were seeing something that was very secretive and very intimate for a woman. And I used a very sheer material which would then create a separation between the subject herself and the viewer as they were admiring or looking at this photograph. And instead of using a pearl earring, I particularly wanted to use a gold earring because I love gold earrings, as you can tell, gold hoops. But I also wanted that to be one of the central main focal points that the viewer saw first when they looked at this image. And I wanted my subject to have a rose in her hair because roses, I love roses. They're one of my favorite flowers, and they're also one of my favorite flowers that my grandfather actually grew in his garden. And I wanted to evoke a sense of romanticism and a sense of intimacy for the subject in the way that, she was particularly posing for the image, to, the way that she had held her shoulder and elongated her neck. All right, let's talk about the equipment that I used to create this. I used my trusty Nikon D810 to use this, and like I said, I always shoot my images in RAW, not in JPEG, because then I have more control over editing process and the light and how I want the image to look. I also use my trusty Nifty 50. A lot of people will have a 50mm lens. This setup has been my workhorse when it comes to creating my portfolio and my client work as well. I had an old frame that was in the studio that I'd taken out like the backing and the photo of it, so it was just the frame itself, so I used that. And I used a very sheer white material to use as the creator for the separator between the viewer and my subject. So now let's talk about the actual concept development and design. And you'll see here in this diagram that I don't have a very big space, studio space when I was creating this. I did have a window that was providing beautiful natural filtered light, which I really wanted to use to an advantage. I set up a backdrop stands, and then I placed my model in front of that backdrop, and then in front of my model we had the frame which we had pulled the white sheer fabric across that each of my assistants was holding, and that was actually in front of my model, and then I was in front of the frame. And what I'd actually did is that before we got the frame up, I'd actually set up my model in the pose that I wanted her to be in. So the pose was going to be very, very demure. It was like something, like I said, something that you would actually do if a lady was in her own boudoir suite. Okay, so it was I knew it was going to be a side shot, and I wanted to really elongate her neck, so I made her really push her neck up and bring her chin down just ever so slightly, and then be looking down, so that down view was very, very elusive, very demure, very seductive, and very romantic as well. And then we put the frame up in front of her. I then positioned the earring directly where her earlobe would be onto the fabric. And because I knew that there was going to be I wanted it to be very, very limited editing. So I was very, very particular in the setup and the setting up of this shoot because I wanted to get it in the first take. Didn't want to have to do too much editing on it, so I was very particular about making sure that the material had no wrinkles in it, that you couldn't actually see the assistant's hands as they were holding the frame, but that you could also very much clearly see her outline of her face and her pose, as well as the rose that was sitting in her hair. And then the drawing attraction was that gold earring that was just sitting there as if like it wasn't being held by anything, and would be very intrigued, would create that intriguing, intimate look for the viewer when they were actually looking at the image. So let's talk about the editing that I did for this photo shoot. I am a Adobe Photoshop girl, have been forever and a day, and I love it. Do you need to use Photoshop? No, you don't. You can use whatever software is your preference when it comes to editing, but I love Photoshop. I knew that when I was going to put this particular photo into Photoshop, there would be minimal editing on it. I wouldn't be doing any editing on her face. The most editing that I would be doing if there was any shadow casting or if there were any wrinkles in the fabric that needed to be edited out. But other than that, oh, and the earring as well, because it was a gold earring, nothing on the actual earring itself, that it looked very clean and very classic as well. So now let's look at the lessons that I learned and what I would actually do if I was to go and recreate this concept again, which, by the way, I actually do want to do. So I'll do that sometime down further in the line. But some of the lessons were that preparation definitely pays off. Like I said, I wanted to do this in the one take. I wanted to make sure that the concept designing was as I had envisioned it, that was very in line with Vermeer's masterpiece as well. So I paid particular attention to how everything was going to be laid out, the filtering of the light that was coming through, pardon me, and then the complete setup of the actual, like, who was going to be positioned where and how the posing was going to be. Okay, some challenge, and the challenge that I did find was that me as the photographer, so I was all in black, but I was actually in front of the frame, so I didn't want to have that shadow cast on the material at all that happens when you're sitting in front of light, right? So I needed to pay particular attention into where I was positioned, so I wasn't creating that shadow cast on that image. Like I said, although I had two assistants with me doing this, you could easily do this with yourself. You just need to set it up in a particular way that the frame was actually secure and held on. You could do it with, clip the material on with bulldog clips down each of the sides so it was nice and taut, and then just position it in a way that it was actually standing or in front of your model to do it. Like I said, future shoots, I would definitely do this type of photo shoot again, and I would create it in a more darkened atmosphere, and I would have the natural light be more directional, which you can do. You can cast natural light in a more directional aspect where it would be coming particularly just across her eye line, that would actually hit that line on the earring and then come down to her jaw. So everything that I wanted to be capturing the viewer's attention would be there, from the rose to the earring to her look to her neck, and then, you know, the demure way that she was actually positioned and sitting. Some final reflections. A minimal approach is always a good thing. Less is actually best, in my opinion, when it comes to concepts and photography concepts like this, because if you make it too complex, then you get caught up in all that complexity as opposed to the really creative aspirations and ideas that you want to do in your photos. I believe that this particular photo had actually successfully mirrored a modern take on Vermeer's masterpiece, The Girl with the Pearl Earring. I was very, very much happy with the final product of it and the piece of it, and it also highlighted the much needed importance of being patient with yourself and when you're creating your art. Taking your time to set things up well will give you a much better outcome when it comes to your final piece or product. And this is, I suppose, where attention to detail comes in, yeah? Like I said, when I did the editing, part of it, I knew that I wanted to do very, very minimal editing, and that was key when it came to the concept of designing and development, making sure that as much as possible could be done prior, so there was no post-production work that needed to be done. And if you enjoyed this breakdown of this particular photography concept, you can go ahead and check out this playlist, which has a lot of other photography concepts that I've actually broken down that you can go then try in your own photography.